am so glad that I got this shirt. It definitely didn't age poorly at all. Hey y'all, welcome to UnScripted. This is essentially a series where we as writers can band together and talk about movies, and why we like them so much. For those that are just coming across this for the first time, this is actually the second part of a two-part series, the first of which will be linked in the iCard right here, right now. So be sure to check that out before you come back here. But for those that are returning, thank you very much, and I want to start with an excerpt. In his book Screenplay, Sid Field brings up quite an interesting thought experiment. He took a class with college students and essentially tried to build a character from the ground up by asking a series of questions. I say, how are we going to start? Boston, a guy booms up from the back of the room. Boston? Yeah, he's from Boston. No, several women yell. She's from Boston. What about her parents, I ask. Who's her father? A doctor, we decide. Her mother? A doctor's wife. What's her father's name? Lionel Townsend. What's his background? We toss a lot of ideas around and finally end up with this. Lionel Townsend belongs to the upper strata of Boston society. Wealthy, smart, conservative, yada yada yada. What about her mother? What was she before she became a doctor's wife? A teacher. Elizabeth's her name, someone remarks. Good. Elizabeth might have been teaching in St. Louis when she met Lionel, and she continues teaching grade school during the time he's completing his medical school education. When he begins his medical practice back in Boston, she gets pregnant and gives up her teaching. A couple pages later is when this finally comes together. Field remarks, remember, I add, drama is conflict. We're searching for ways to generate tension in our material. I explain that the relationship between mother and daughter may be useful during the screenplay, or it may not be. There's a lot of discussion about this. I explain that when we're creating a character, you have to compile nuances that you can either use or not. I tell the class this exercise is based on trial and error. We're going to see what works and discard what doesn't. This may seem a bit preachy or fanboyish, but I believe Luke Skywalker's portrayal in 8 definitely falls under this category of hidden nuances. While the original trilogy all stems from the hero's journey story arc in the larger sense, as well as individually spaced out between the 3 films, a lot of the other quirky character traits that Luke Skywalker embodies are often kind of pushed to the wayside. I'm a wholehearted believer that a character's starting point and their ending point are not entirely different, as in they don't completely shed their persona that they embody in the beginning of the story to adopt this sort of new persona towards the end. It's just that more amiable traits tend to be put on a pedestal later on in the story, as that's kind of where the character's upward progression is supposed to go. It's that interesting dichotomy of character nuance that I believe forms the foundation of the entire sequel trilogy. Luke Skywalker in the original trilogy, no matter how you see it, was always an underdog defending a previous principle from an old republic. Now, in between the time of the original trilogy and the sequel trilogy, we see him come into his own as a leader defending it. Naturally, this comes with adopting different values and different priorities, but if you've ever met anybody in real life, you know that their professional persona is a lot different than their personal persona. Somewhere deep down inside, Luke Skywalker is still that scrappy and impatient little kid from Tatooine that he was at the beginning of episode 4. I believe that conflict between necessary leadership and impulse is what Ben Solo brought out of him. In this scenario, Skywalker is the mother Elizabeth, and Ben Solo is the daughter that the mother never wanted until she had to. And now I'm kind of rambling, so I'm just going to let that go, and we'll return to Luke Skywalker in a little bit. But first, I really want to talk about the new characters like Kylo Ren and Rey. All right, you know the drill. First big question, how does our past influence our future? It's clear that the goal of episode 7 was to pass on the torch to a younger generation. I mean, how else is Disney going to milk this franchise for as long as possible? But seriously, it delights me to no end that it seems this choice has a genuine intention with a lesson to teach. The combined effort of Abrams and Johnson asked the question of whether or not it's possible to live up to the legacy of those who came before you. I mean, they're standing on the shoulders of giants such as Lucas and Kirshner, but in Kylo Ren's case, he knows it's not possible. So he tries harder and harder to actively push past that and try to establish himself as better than his predecessors, whatever Vader couldn't be. But I've already gushed about how great and complex Kylo is. Pulling back and looking at the entire First Order, it's clear that they are trying to escape the shadow of the Empire. I mean, if there's some new edgy extremist group inspired by the Empire or a fractured piece of the old Empire, it would make sense, then, that they would want to prove that they could stand on their own. They're wannabes, and Snoke is the biggest one of them all, pushing Kylo into this impossible position of living up to his Skywalker name, to rule vicariously through him. He and the rest of the First Order posture around like a powerful force, but Hux and Kylo Ren show on a more human scale how ill-equipped that they are, demonstrating that not everyone can live up to the legacy of the ancestors. At least Snoke was the calm glue holding the facade together, but since Kylo assumed the role of Supreme Leader, we have a loose cannon, and that has the potential to be a lot more volatile and threatening to our heroes and to himself. Let's move on to Rey the Optimist. Rey Nobody is the complete opposite of Kylo Ren in this regard. She wholeheartedly believes that the stories of Han Solo, the Millennium Falcon, Luke Skywalker, and the rest are 100% true and are unstuck in time. She wants so badly to live up to these legends, to have a place in the larger story of good and evil. However, she often sees her heroes fall, or rather not meet her own expectations, and therefore she loses faith in herself, not getting answers to her questions, not training in the ways of the ones that came before her. She doubts she can become a hero herself. Kylo feels the same way, but powers through by alienating himself and alienating everything else from his past. After having those really cool mind-trippy conversations with Kylo, and after Luke admits that in the moment of weakness he tried to kill young Ben Solo, Rey realizes that she doesn't want to give up being a hero in the same way as Luke. She instead learns to take the world on as she sees it, not as she'd like it to be, and does something unconventional. She goes to appeal to Kylo, not confront him, improving on the pitfalls of her predecessors. Now we come to the big boy, Luke Skywalker, the legend. Luke tries to live up to the legacy of the Jedi Knights, training his own generation of Jedi, but over time, especially with the turn of Ben Solo, he learned how flawed and narrow-minded the Jedi were. When he employed the same practices, trying to honor their legacy, he learned how flawed their methodology was. Without putting it into practice, how could he? He was not around during the height of the Jedi Order, but that's what makes him the perfect candidate to reshape it. The problems with the Jedi and Sith were only visible when we see from an objective viewpoint. That's hindsight. It's not like Obi-Wan looking back on his glory days in 4. That's what makes Rey turn to trusting Kylo Ren so engaging. She eventually sees him as a human with conflicting emotions, not just blindly hating him as the enemy. It's the complete opposite of Snoke's plan to eradicate the Jedi Order so that the Sith can prevail. This trilogy is about blurring and dissolving these lines between good and evil. That's so fascinating. Luke learns this too from his conversation with Yoda, in the most poignant and condensed version of this entire essay. We are what they grow beyond. Luke understands that he must grow beyond the flaws of his past, by either eradicating them or changing them. In his response, shutting himself off from the Force and abandoning the Jedi lessons. However, by the end of the film, Luke does something really intriguing. He sees the flaws of the Jedi Order, but he finally embraces them. He improves on his ancestors, having laid out for Rey and the audience why the Jedi methodology must end, but in his final heroic act demonstrating that the Jedi should continue to live, but as a more neutral force in the galaxy, keepers of the balance, not just keepers of the peace. This is really heavily implied in the final trailer for 8. Hang on, what was it again?
The balance is so much bigger.
Oh my god. One of my favorite trailers of all time. Light, darkness, balance. It's so much bigger. Those are the big players in this section. Others like Han and Leia, etc. play into it too, but not to this interesting of an outcome. And plus this video is going to be really long anyway, so I don't want to make it longer arbitrarily. Anyway, this leads perfectly into the second question that I teased earlier. What role should the Force play in the universe, and what is the significance of that? Sorry, Lucas, but this entire Star Wars saga is not poetry. It's a clear and concise character arc. One of the first things I said about this new trilogy is that it's the third act of a 9-part saga, and thematically, that's exactly what we should see unfold. In the beginning is the prequel trilogy. The Jedi are at the height of their power, and the line between good and evil is clearly drawn. It's the status quo that is established early on in all stories so that the audience can know when things change for our heroes. Towards the end of 3, when Anakin makes his turn to the dark side, we hear and see brief glimpses into the mind of someone who has become disillusioned with the Jedi, highlighting their hypocrisy, exclusivity, and ignorance towards the universe, outside of their circle. This thematically leads nicely into the second act. Starting in the original trilogy, the lines of good and evil are still very clearly drawn, but there's a twist. With Luke and Vader's dynamic, there exists a new way of understanding the light side and the dark side. It's harmonizing with one person at a time. The original trilogy takes place at a time where stories of the Jedi and Sith are mere folklore. As is the same in real life, as lore is passed down through the generations, the fantasies get more and more ridiculous, and the legacies of their heroes grow in stature. Luke learns about the ways of the Force, the light side, and the dark, but he faces conflict and inner turmoil when he discovers that his father, whom he had presumed dead, is in fact the most feared villain in Star Wars canon. It's here that we see his desire to see his father redeemed. It's a new concept, one that contests the old Jedi ideologies of clear good and bad because, again, Luke is speaking from an outsider's perspective. He is unwittingly paving the way for the future of the franchise by understanding the nature of balance in light and dark. However, even earlier in the story, we see Luke impulsively draw on dark side emotions in the Dagobah Cave in 5, as well as in the throne room battle in 6. Both times, his emotions are not seen as demonstrably bad, but as natural reactions to certain situations. Both times, it is either taught to Luke or implied that he naturally has darker emotions, such as Yoda's response when Luke says, when he's entering the cave, "What's in there?" Yoda says, "Only what you take with you." What's not explicitly said is how Luke should handle this conflict. Should he fight it, or should he learn to balance himself and coexist with it? By the end of the second act of the saga, Luke makes his answer clear. He appeals to Vader's underlying lighter emotions, his humanity, understanding that there's a neutral balance within him, the second most vile man in the galaxy. This set the stage for what I believe the main theme of the final trilogy is going to be for the saga: the balancing of the Force, and the destruction of polar good and polar bad. We see this in Luke's vendetta against the one-sided Jedi, and especially through Rey understanding that not only should Kylo and could he be redeemed in 8, but that they could only achieve it together, yin and yang in perfect harmony. That's made more impactful when you take into account Rey soaking in all of Luke's words. She has heard that the Force, and the peace, violence, and overall balance it brings, belongs in everyone, but it's up to each individual person how they will tap into that. Balance between two people, even good and evil, can create a perfect synergy. Like in this really cool fight with the Praetorian Guards. Now it's up to Abrams and the entirety of Episode 9 how they wrap up what they've been setting up. But it looks like they're changing the status quo of the Star Wars universe in a good way. They're making sure the world stays fresh in concept with new stories to tell, with a clear progression to be shown. That may be seen as more of the corporate marketing side of things, but it also works perfectly for a thematic standpoint. This brings me to my next point on how these films excel past the rest. It's not about the Skywalkers, it's about the larger galaxy. It's clear these films are trying to broaden the scope of the story to be about more than the Skywalker lineage, but about the Force in general, and how it ties the universe together. Like I said, not only does this allow future directors and writers to zoom back in on specific characters that aren't Skywalker blood, but it also allows for the characters to grow in new and interesting ways, like I previously mentioned about Luke. But in the broadest scope, it's putting the universe back where it should be, connecting the balance of the Force so that it's balanced between itself, containing both good and bad. Not balance, meaning the division between clear good and clear bad. The Jedi and the Old Republic were set to eradicate the Sith. Meanwhile, Luke in 8 understands the balance of keeping darkside energy on his sacred island. The darkside cave is vital to Rey's characterization. On the surface, not having a clear explanation, but deep down it reveals her almost fatalistic desire to find her parents. The cave calling Rey echoes Rey's darker emotions like fear, anxiety, confusion, impatience, and loss. But Luke says that it's necessary, and creates true balance on the island, and therefore inside Rey. The Force connection between Rey and Kylo hammers this home, although it could have used some clarification in the movie rather than just telling us to do our homework by reading a book or watching Rebels. It clearly symbolizes the darkness rising and light to meet it, as Snoke said. Not clash, but come together as a single understanding. It's a good message to end the saga on, a striking metaphor for the world today, and a logical endpoint considering where the understanding of the Force started. Again, we see the Old Republic with Yoda and Mace Windu and Obi-Wan and Anakin as idealistic, but as the first act of the story, there should be room to change. There should be inherent flaws in this, and the characters and the ideas and themes need to evolve with the times. CL3, that is how you do a metaphor for equality. So that's pretty much everything I have to say about why I love the direction Disney is taking parts of this franchise. Instead of just summing up my thoughts again, I'd like to end with a word of caution. With the backlash of 8 and more recently Solo, it seems like everyone over at Lucasfilm is trying their best to course correct the franchise to better appeal to a mass audience. We've already seen rumors that JJ might retcon Rey's true parentage and that leaves the door wide open for a lot of creative decisions that will inevitably compromise the story and themes Johnson and JJ himself have already laid out. Movies that transcend entertainment and have something to say about us are so impactful, but so rare. Think about how many movies come out each year and how many we actually remember. I know going into 9 that Daisy Ridley, Adam Driver, John Boyega, Oscar Isaac, and the rest are going to deliver amazing performances. The visuals and music are going to be fantastic, but to borrow a phrase from Mr. Star Wars himself, George Lucas, a special effect is just a tool, a means of telling a story. A special effect without a story is a pretty boring thing. Lucasfilm, don't let the raving masses dictate how you conclude one of the most impactful, influential, and visionary film series of all time. Sincerely, a longtime fan. Yeah, but so anyway, those are just a little bit of my ramblings on the goings-on of the Disney Star Wars era. I really appreciate you making it to the end of this really long, really drawn-out two-part episode of Unscripted. The series is a lot longer than I typically want to try to shoot for, but I just had a lot to say. And also, I know that a lot of you really like a lot of content to vehemently disagree with, or just really rally behind. Either way, thank you very much for watching. I try to put out these more informal, quasi-analytical videos about once a week or so, so be sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell to be notified of my next upload. I love any kind of feedback that you give me on this series, and I really like to read what you have to say down in the comments below. Bye!